Good evening. Quietly and discreetly, the Mafia said goodbye today to its reputed boss of all bosses, Carlo Gambino, as discreetly as 13 Cadillac limousines, thousands of dollars worth of floral tributes, and an audience of cops and reporters would permit. Gambino was said to be courtly. He was Sicilian-born, habituated to Homburg hats. He bowed to his associates and settled disputes diplomatically. When he died in his sleep of a heart attack on Friday, age 74, he was still the most powerful crime boss in the country, the underworld president of the United States, some said. His empire included a crime family 1,000 strong and sway over 4 other Mafia families. There were thousands of visitors to the Queen's funeral home where his body lay in state all weekend. After Mass today at Our Lady of Grace in Brooklyn, he was laid to rest in a $7,000 bronze coffin. Gambino was the last of the present generation of Mafia leaders to have been born in Sicily. Tonight we examine what Gambino's death may mean to the structure, activities, and general future of the Mafia. But first, a little history. Jim?
The Mafia was born in Sicily near the end of the 13th century. It was imported to the United States about 90 years ago. Its record here is littered with double crosses, bloody rivalries, and a lot of mystique. Prohibition gave the Mafia its biggest boost and ignited gang warfare for control of Chicago. That battle climaxed in the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. When liquor went legal, mob money poured into gambling, prostitution, and other assorted rackets where it still is to varying degrees. During its first 80 or so years in this country, the Mafia operated behind a wall of silence. Then in 1963, mobster Joe Valachi turned informer and sang for the Senate Permanent Investigation Subcommittee. The names he spilled were a Mafia Hall of Fame: Luciano, Anastasia, Costello, Bonanno, Profaci, Genovese, and Gambino. This real-world exposure has been accompanied by a fiction counterpart, best-selling books and money-making movies that have kept both the nasty realities and the glamorous mystique of the Mafia always in public view. Robin?
Nicholas Gage has been an investigative reporter for 15 years. He covers organized crime and political corruption for the New York Times and is the author of 5 books, among them Mafia USA and The Mafia is Not an Equal Opportunity Employer. Mr. Gage, tell us more about Gambino. Was he the real Godfather?
In a way he was. He was probably the last Mafia boss to command the kind of respect, the kind of power, quiet power, that the fictional Godfather had. He was not, as he has been referred to, the boss of bosses. There has not been a boss of bosses in the Mafia since 1931. When Lucky Luciano overthrew the last boss of bosses and established collective leadership in a council of 9 to 12 bosses who made policy for the 26 families of the United States. But in this council, Gambino was the most powerful figure, and his family was the strongest, the richest, the most invulnerable to federal penetration of all the families. And this was largely due to Gambino's cunning, to his intelligence, to his organizing skill.
So we should more properly call him the nearest thing today, or up till Friday, to a boss of all bosses.
Right.
in the Mafia. His style of leadership seems to have been very different from some of the more violence-prone leaders of the past. Was he innocent of violence himself?
Not at all. When it served his purpose, he became the boss of his family in 1957 when the then boss of the family, Albert Anastasia, was killed, assassinated in a barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in New York City. And the Gallo brothers were said to be the actual hitmen who killed Anastasia, but Gambino was implicated in that murder, went along with it, encouraged it, according to Joseph Valachi, Later, when there was a fight to see who would take over command of the family between himself and Aniello della Croce, he simply instructed his men to make sure that della Croce's top assistants disappeared, and then they invited della Croce to a conference, and he emerged the leader and della Croce the underboss. It shows how he worked. He worked quietly but effectively. He used violence when it was necessary, but avoided the limelight. He did not like when people that his family killed. They weren't killed on the streets or in a restaurant. They simply disappeared. He did not like headlines. He believed that
they disappeared, but they're not living up in a rest home in the Catskills.
No. They were killed, but they weren't killed dramatically. They didn't invite his headlines.
Okay. We'll come back. Thank you. Jim?
Jay Waldman is Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department's Criminal Division here in Washington, and as such is responsible for the department's organized crime program. Mr. Waldman, what is your department's information about what's going to happen now? Will there be a peaceful transition of power within the Mafia, or a bloody one, do you think?
Well, if history is any indication, I suppose one could expect that there could be some bloodshed, at least in the metropolitan New York area. But really, we kind of look at the passing of Mr. Gambino and the whole generation of crime leadership, which Mr. Gage referred to, is kind of the end product rather than the beginning of a new stage.
What do you mean there?
It really kind of signifies the passing, to some extent, of the whole way of operating that was conventionally associated with organized crime. Today, I think what you're finding more of is organized crime elements at the higher echelon really moving into more sophisticated areas of criminality.
Such as?
Such as stock fraud and manipulation, such as the paper crimes, various sorts of fraud and corruption schemes. To be sure, they're still present in the conventional type of activities, but increasingly, as you see a breakdown of the type that these gentlemen in New York were discussing, you see more and more freelancers in some of the old cities also moving into these conventional street crime type activities.
Now, with Gambino gone, no matter what, who comes out on top, whether it's bloody or peaceful or whatever, you see more of this continuing trend, or do you think there will be, for instance, one of the men who's been mentioned as a potential successor to Gambino is a man named Gallietti, who is considered a very violent man compared to Gambino and more interested in drugs and that kind of thing?
Well, I don't want to comment necessarily on particular personalities,
okay.
But there is no question that there are still persons associated with the old school of leadership who most certainly are interested in continuing in some of the conventional type of racketeering activities which involve violence, whether it's hijacking, narcotics trafficking, and so forth. But I think what you're getting is an increasing amount of lower level and freelance individuals and different ethnic groups who are moving into some of these areas in some of the older cities. And I think what you're finding is that the modern generation of organized crime leadership is more often to be found moving to the west and the southwest and in the Sun Belt and engaging...
Just like everybody else.
Just like everybody else. They follow the money. And today, it's really more profitable, I suppose, to engage in a lot of crimes in the area of fraud and stock manipulation, infiltration of legitimate businesses and unions. And I think what you also find that is terribly important is that many of the profits that have been generated by this type of conventional racketeering activity over the years have amassed huge fortunes. And today, you really are into a new era where the name of the game is very often to find legitimate sources in the business world to invest this money. Unfortunately, when organized crime moves into legitimate business, it takes with it all the disadvantages for its competitors of the ways that organized crime operates, including strong arm and muscling and so forth. But I think the federal effort today is aimed more at tracing the cash flow, tracing the funds that have been generated by the illegal activities of the street into the private sector, in the unions, in the businesses, where they're now being used to perpetuate the power of these people.
Rather than targeting the illegal activity itself?
Well, to the extent that it is demonstrated that the old type crime overlord is still involved directly or indirectly in that activity, we would of course pursue it. But increasingly you're finding ever increasing lower level figures and freelancers turning up at that level.
Rather than people who are under the direct control of the big overlords, as you call them, right?
Well, this is correct. At least there is certainly a trend. These things don't happen starkly. They don't happen overnight. But I think Mr. Gambino's passing, for instance, might more signify a trend that has already been underway long before he and others of his background have aged and finally passed on.
All right. Thank you. Robin?
Dennis Dillon knows and has been fighting the family in both city and suburb. He's now Nassau County's district attorney, Nassau County, New York. From 1969 to 74, Mr. Dillon was director of the Department of Justice Strike Force for Organized Crime in New York. Mr. Dillon, how does organized crime, the family, the mafia, whatever you want to call it, touch the lives of ordinary Americans?
Well, Bob, I think organized crime touches the lives of ordinary Americans, consumers, very intimately. The huge profits that the syndicate makes from its illegal activities in gambling, for instance, loan sharking, labor racketeering, very often gets invested in legitimate businesses. Now, as was pointed out before, the mob will bring in some of its illegal type activity into the operation of the legal businesses. They will conduct very often what we call scam operations. They will buy a business or move into a business and then defraud the creditors. They'll order many goods and not pay for the goods and move out, and the business will go into bankruptcy. Or very often they'll use violent tactics to sell their products. They'll become engaged very often in labor racketeering, where they'll enter into sweetheart contracts with employers, where employees don't get the benefits that they would be entitled to under regular collective bargaining.
What you're saying is they matter.
They certainly do.
Is it an obstacle to you and to your colleagues with the Justice Department in Washington that the public has apparently such a romantic view of the mafia?
Well, it makes it a problem, really, in trying to enforce the laws against the mafia. I think the fact that they have been romanticized makes it more difficult. I think also the fact that the public very often is afraid to come forward because of what's been written about the mafia. They're afraid to come forward and testify. And I think very often this fear is exaggerated. The public doesn't realize that witnesses who come forward who are not part of the mob itself
and subject to punishment by their own internal rules.
Within the mob, have very little fear once they come forward and testify and the case is over.
What kind of headway do you feel you're making at the local level? You're the DA of Nassau County. Nassau County is where Carlo Gambino lived and where a number of his associates still live.
Right. We have quite a few mafia members living in Nassau County. I believe the New York Times said 175 at the last count. We are making headway out there. We're trying to make, in Nassau County, substantive cases against people in organized crime. By that, I mean we're not trying to just run them through the grand jury as had been done historically by local prosecutors and trying to put them in jail for short periods for contempt or perjury or whatever. We're really trying to work on the gambling syndicates and the loan sharks who are active within the county. Many of the people who live in the county are not active in the county. They move into, it's a bedroom community for them. They do a lot of their illegal work in New York City, but we do have our own people active
crime commuters.
Right, but I mean those are the ones that are well known. But and very often people forget about the loan sharks we have active in the county who are not well known, possibly to the press. The large gambling syndicates that are active within the county. We're trying to work on those syndicates and try to get the top people, and we've been successful.
Okay, thank you. Peter MAAS, a leading investigative reporter and writer, is the author of The Valachi Papers, Serpico, and The King of the Gypsies. Mr. MAAS, what changes have you observed in the mafia in the last 10 years or so?
Not too many. I think somewhat more sophisticated, possibly across the country, working a little bit more in the shadows than they have before. But I think the old standbys still work for them. The gambling, illegal gambling, is still the major source of income. Loan sharking, labor racketeering, those are the old standbys. And they still work. They supply all the things that I've just mentioned, supply something the public wants.
Which is?
Money. The gambling, and when I think
they supply services.
Yes, that the public wants that are illegal. Somebody who can't borrow money through legitimate channels goes to the organized crime. Has done that historically. Gambling is something that people want to do. It's illegal in most places, and even where it is legal now, it's been done so ineptly generally that they really the state's efforts to legalize gambling has really just encouraged more people to gamble illegally, I think.
What changes would you foresee as a result of Carlo Gambino's death?
Well, I think you're going to have an upheaval. He became, certainly in the New York area. We must remember that the Mafia stretches across the country, and we here in New York tend to think that what's happened here means you don't have the same unrest everywhere that you do here. What happened here is that he became the top man out from the fall. He was a wily person who outlived all the other bosses that you showed earlier in the show and inherited all this power. Now he, along with all these other bosses, hung on longer than they should have. This created a great deal of unrest, as you can imagine, underneath, and the others went, he still stayed on, and with his passing, I think he ended up with the largest family of the 5 families in New York, and I think they're all going to be fragmented now, and everybody's going to be out after their piece.
You say that the Mafia is not only in New York, but is spread around many other parts of the country, and Mr. Walden mentioned the Sun Belt and
Yes.
so on. Is it also becoming something of an international corporation? Is it broadening its activities overseas?
To a degree, I think mostly in gambling. Their infiltration of businesses on that level I don't think is as far as we'd like to imagine. I don't think they're all that smart. I think they go in for one big score, stock manipulation, fraud here, fraud there. They grab. They'll run a local business into bankruptcy and take all the money. They'll do the same thing on an international level, except for the gambling, not the casinos particularly. I think they were very interested in.
Do you feel that the American public generally tends to regard the Mafia as more as a sort of colorful part of our culture than as a real crime menace?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't know. When I first wrote the Valachi papers and offered it to publishers in New York, that's 7 years ago, 22 publishers turned it down. They all said that the Mafia didn't sell. I thought I was writing a definitive history of the Mafia. It turned out I was creating a new industry. There have been 65 books since. I think there is that fascination there. I think one of the things that's made people more interested in the Mafia is when certain Mafia people are personalized, when people can connect with them, like a Joe Valachi or as Mario Puzo did with Don Corleone, where you can connect with him. He becomes a real three-dimensional person. I think they're less interested when it's a series of abstract reports about what they're doing.
So you are the godfather of the Mafia as a public institution.
Well, unfortunately, I guess.
Will it matter who succeeds Gambino?
Yes, I think it will. I think a lot of people are going to get hurt. I think it's going to cause interruption. I don't think anything. He represented a certain stability, if you will, which we're no longer going to have. I remember the night the 4 innocent businessmen were mowed down in a restaurant called the Neapolitan Noodle. It's possible that kind of thing could happen. I think there's a lot out there that they want to grab, and a lot of people want it.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, let's open this up now, gentlemen. First to you, Nick Gage. Do you agree that a lot of people are going to get hurt in these next few weeks while this thing sifts its way down to a new leadership?
I don't think it's going to happen in the next 2 weeks.
First few weeks, I mean, you know.
First of all, the man who is most likely to take over the family, Agnello della Croce, still has two more months to serve in jail. So he won't be out for 2 months. I think what is likely to happen is that there will be a confrontation. There will be a strike for. There will be an effort to take out the toughest men of one supporter or the other, and whoever does that first is going to emerge the leader. There are a couple of points about that I would like to pursue that have been mentioned here. One is, does the glamorization of the mafia hurt law enforcement efforts? There's a very good example. Recently there was a man named John Catroni who was killed in a diner in Brooklyn, and I've been looking into who killed him. And I went out to the area and I talked to a number of people, and they weren't very cooperative, and the attitude was basically, well, if they killed him, he must have done something against them, you know. I mean, they've sort of adopted the values, the readers have adopted the values of the Godfathers, you know. So it was very difficult getting information from just ordinary people in the street. I agree with Peter that they're not as sophisticated as everybody seems to feel. Gambino took his people out of paper, out of dealing in stocks and bonds, because they didn't understand it very well, and a lot of them were set up by law enforcement because they were out to make a score, and the guy they were selling to turned out to be an FBI agent or an informant for the FBI. While I think they're going into these areas, I don't think it's going to happen as swiftly as some people believe.
Well, let me ask all of you, beginning with you, Mr. Waldman, what kind of telltale clue should we be looking for in terms of a new direction or a new leadership? Obviously, if four businessmen get mowed down in a barber shop, that'll be a good clue. But other than that, when are we going to know when the Mafia goes through this thing and makes a decision or evolves into a new direction post-Gambino?
Oh, probably when Nick Gage reports it. No, seriously, one of the things that we're obviously concentrating heavily on is the continual development and assessment of intelligence in this area. That's one of the primary functions of the Special Strike Forces, which have been deployed around the United States by the Department of Justice. I think in these situations, again, if history's any indicator, you just have to wait for the thing to shake out. Yeah. Bodies turn up, they're identified, they're investigated, rarely solved as far as the murders go, and you wait and you see who emerges.
I would like to ask you this, but also beginning also with Mr. Dillon. You know, a lot of people in the general public feel that you law enforcement people spend all your time watching the Mafia and have a lot of great information on the Mafia, but you don't do anything about it, Mr. Dillon.
Well, you know, I don't even know if they're right about that, because in this particular family, the Gambino family, our intelligence has never been really that good. But no, law enforcement's been very successful over the last 6 or 7 years against the Mafia. There have been a number of very good convictions. Thinking of people such as John Sonny Francis and the Colombo family. Of course, Carlo Gambino himself was indicted twice. He couldn't be brought to trial because he had a bad heart. Carmine Persico, Copper Regime, and the Colombo family, Paul Varia. I could go right down and name people, you know, a long list of people that have been indicted and convicted by federal and local law enforcement. So,
yes.
I think you raise a very good point, though, and one that ought to be pursued. And it is true that when Mr. Dillon, who headed an organized crime strike force for the Justice Department in Brooklyn, did an excellent job of penetrating the Colombo family and achieving great success. But I really think there's something the public has to understand. And I understand your question. A lot of people read every report from the Kefauver report on and say, wait a minute, we know who all these people are.
That's right.
Why are they still walking around in the street? And I think what the public has to understand is there is a real difference between what you know, even as a fact, something that you and I would accept in everyday conversation as a fact, and what you can prove beyond any reasonable doubt in an American courtroom under the American system and the American rules of evidence, which are purposely designed to make it more difficult to obtain conviction in many cases.
Peter Maas, what do you think? Do you think American law enforcement at the local and federal level are handling the enforcement against organized crime in an effective way?
I think on the federal level, it's been better. I think beginning with Robert Kennedy, he was the first Attorney General who approached organized crime with any rational, but he was interested in it and approached it on a rational basis. I think almost all the efforts, many new laws were passed as a result of his stewardship in the Justice Department. I think since then it's been better. If this is a never-ending war, there's never going to be a victory. As I said earlier, as long as the mob supplies certain things that the public wants, they're going to be in business. And I think while it's a war that can't be won, it's certainly one that has to be contained. I think
Nick Gage, how would you evaluate law enforcement's attack on the Mafia?
I think there's been progress in some areas. I think the Colombo family, for example, has been practically decimated as a result of a strong law enforcement effort. I think the Gambino family was barely touched. I think it's a tribute to Mr. Gambino's leadership. I think that we have to remember that organized crime is not just the Mafia, that the Mafia is one element of organized crime. When we talk, for example, the biggest gang war in recent times was in Boston when close to 60 gangsters killed each other off. Almost all of them belonged to Irish gangs. They had little to do with the Mafia except a certain corporation. There are all kinds of organized crime groups out there, and the Mafia is getting most of the attention and has been hit the hardest. But what I'm concerned about are the groups that don't get the attention and therefore don't get the pressure from law enforcement. I would like to make one last point about
Can you make it in 15 seconds?
Yes, that to show how the Mafia affects the average person, it is estimated that 15% of the price of meat in New York goes to organized crime because of its effect on labor relations and transportation and so forth.
Well, that's a good statistic to digest with your supper. Thank you very much in Washington. Thank you all here. Jim Lehrer and I'll be back tomorrow evening. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
For a transcript, send $1 to the McNeil Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10019. The McNeil Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content. The program was made possible in part by grants from public television stations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Exxon Corporation, and the Ford Foundation.